everyone. So the conversation that I'm going to be having with you today is not an easy one to process, and I'm not going to pretend that it is, because it's not an easy one for me to process. But we need to start talking about it. The story that I'll be telling you will have mentions of physical brutality, pain, conflict, fighting against norms, and questioning them. So today, I stand before you as a person who's trying to fight a norm and is struggling to defy it. At the age of 2 all the way to the age of 6, I am a survivor of severe physical brutality. The domestic help in my house, who was hired to take care of me, was actually my abuser. She treated me in ways that I knew that no one else ever had the right to treat me in. I also knew for a fact that everything that she did to me, or every inch of pain that was ever caused, was with the motivation of saying that behind pain, there is an art of endurance. She glamorized it in my life to such an extent that I believed that in order to ever achieve something, pain is a part of it. And honestly, that's something a lot of us have grown up learning. She glamorized it in such a way that I almost idealized the abuse. I was living 2 lives. One was like a secret association at home where only I and she knew about it. She would do things and I would have to keep it a secret. She trained me and accustomed me to just lying over and over again to my family and my friends, so no one would ever know. And the second life was the life I had with my family. A-okay, said I wasn't hurt, said I was just fine. But that's the problem, right? We start thinking that when you beat a child, it might be for discipline, it might be to ingrain some information into the child's mind. But is that actually what you're doing? Or is it that peaceful conversation children have with their parents after they've been hit that actually teaches them what was right or wrong? We often associate pain to a lesson. But is the child not performing that behavior anymore because the child is afraid? Or has the child actually learned why it's wrong? What happened to me was really sad. And in my conscious mind, I knew that what was happening to me was very wrong. But subconsciously, I was so ingrained to the thought that this is what people are going to be like. And in order to achieve something, you had to go through pain. And so eventually, as I grew, I was so conditioned to the notion of this that I assumed that those older than me had a power over me like none other. They could treat me in ways that I could never treat them. And I simply had to accept it. By the 9th grade, I started suffering from severe mental health problems. I had jittery hands, I couldn't stand still, I would sweat. I couldn't see clearly, I would get fuzzy, and I was a public speaker, so it was hard for me. And ultimately what happened was I would keep working and finding things that would instantly gratify me, and I said I was doing that because I was a hard worker. But the truth was that everything I was doing was because I wanted to silence my mind. Because when I had a moment alone to think, I knew that I would be so overwhelmed with thoughts of how much I despised myself in that moment that I wouldn't be able to bear with it. So I fought and I kept doing it until I could silence my brain, and I never knew how to just be. You know that Sunday morning where you can sit in bed for 10 minutes and say, I'm just going to sit and stare at the window? I didn't know how that felt until my 12th grade. Eventually, by the time I hit the 11th and 12th grade, I was diagnosed with like 100 things. I had like anxiety, depression, OCD, complex PTSD, and it was hard, right? Because you're trying to come to terms with all these words that have been thrown at you, but you're still trying to work through them. But here's what happened. Eventually, I started studying my own body. It's a fact that all of us at some point in our lives, and I'm not going to say all, to be precise, it's about 77% of us, 77% of at least my generation that's sitting in this room, has been hit at least once with a purpose of discipline. So that could have been by their parents, that could have been by teachers, caregivers, something or the other. And this number is not even a number that is reported to the cops. This is a number that has been got from interactions with families. So think about how many of those families must have lied. So we are talking about, technically, a good 80% of our population who has grown up with the notion of pain. And do we have that kind of authority over a child's life? Can we say with confidence that what we're doing is right? Me and thousands of other children go through the confusion of not understanding what is happening. When we have physical violence put upon us by a loved one, we start assuming that is their way to express their love towards us. And that is something that we have to start rethinking, that we have to start shaping. So eventually what happened was, when I got out of the 12th grade, I got into a gap year and I decided to have a nonprofit and work for people who've been with stories like mine. And something I focused on was, how do I tell my body that it's safe? How do I tell my body that when it's in a room full of people, they're not there to attack you, and that you have control over your own body? I started using something that I like to call a mental health first aid kit. So it was just for my mind. It was designed in such a way that it would instill all of my senses. So I had a little box that smelled like lavender, very strong lavender for smell. For sight, I had little rustling beads that was super colorful. For hearing, I would rustle them. For touch, I had slime that I would play with in my hands. And for taste, I had sour candy. And the point of all of this was, we've all had that moment where you stand in one place and you're like, the world is falling apart and I don't know how to deal with it. We've had that before exams, before a meeting, when you come out of a terrible conference. We all have that moment. And in that moment, what helped me was to ground myself, to tell me that this is reality and you have control over the situation. And so when I would smell the lavender, when I was able to touch clay, when I was able to feel it, I could feel my senses coming back to life. I could feel myself and say that I am safe, that I am not in a situation like I was when I was a child, that I can still move on with life and I will be A-okay about it. I had an interesting case study that I worked on this with. I visited, so I'm a social worker, right? So I basically do a lot of house visits with children who are survivors of violence or are going through it at this point. And so I met this 9-year-old girl. And I sat with her, and she wouldn't make eye contact with me. And I was like, okay, that's fine. But I really needed to know what her story was, if we needed to take action, what was happening, and I had no idea of how to get through to her. And she didn't know what to do with her hands. She kept tapping her feet. She got up, she walked around a bunch of times, and she didn't know how to just stay still and put her thoughts in an order that she could say it out to me. So I got out my mental health first aid kit. I put a little jar in front of her, and I gave her beads. And I said, arrange them upwards, color-wise. And she said, okay. And she'd put in one bead at a time. And as she put in one bead at a time, I said, now, you just tell me yeses and nos. And so I started my interaction with her in that way. What happened was, all of a sudden, her focus was not on the person talking to her, her focus was on the beads. So all she had to do to me was listen. The awkwardness was eliminated from the situation. Suddenly, she had something to do and not feel guilty about her own situation. And that to me was pretty marvelous. That something as simple as simply starting to do an activity and waiting for the person to have their touch with reality again could create so much change. But, I mean, let's be honest, right? I wasn't able to do this until I was able to tell myself that I deserved the help. So I had a mantra to myself, and I would keep saying, all pain is pain, you have no place to judge. All pain is pain, you have no place to judge. Which is basically to say that if anyone is in pain, I can't put it on a meter and say that your pain is more than my pain. And while I tried to do that, to convince everyone in the world around me, I was saying that more to convince myself. Because I needed to know that my pain was valid and that I deserved to get help from it. So the first step to actually being able to tackle something that you're dealing with is establishing and understanding and truly understanding that you deserve to feel better. Now, I have to say that this really doesn't change the fact that we live in a world where violence is so prevalent. Violence is all around us. Physical abuse, especially in Asian and the Eastern society that we have, is very, very prevalent. We have religious texts that propagate it to a large degree that say that pain, there's like dharma in pain, which is scary to even hear, because you are working with the notion of normalizing the idea that pain is going to get you to someplace great. And so all our children today are sitting in an environment where they've learned to simply adjust to it and not even acknowledge that it's a problem. So what do? We have a situation where physical violence is not taken as seriously, but we are fortunate that we live in a world where sexual violence is now getting recognition. But we have a long way to go for emotional and physical violence with children. Our laws provide for physical violence committed upon our children. We have the IPC, we have POCSO for sexual assault, we have the JJ Act for physical assault, but there is no mandatory reporting. So who do you hold accountable in that part? When you have sexual assault, as citizens, I think some of you may be aware that if you know that it's happened to a child, you are a mandatory reporter in your capacity as an individual citizen of India. But we don't have that with physical assault. And what does that mean? What does that truly say about how our law is treating different kinds of pain? And is it fair to truly put a child through that? Because let's be honest, we created culture. This culture that we have that normalizes pain and that normalizes all of these things is something that we have propagated ourselves. So honestly, give it 100, 200 years, and you take it upon yourself to say that I will change the way physical abuse is looked at. In about 100 years or so, you've created a culture of your own. And this is a culture that could actually maybe empathize.